The Hollis place sat on a fold of ground above Kettle Creek in the Basin country south of Sheridan, where the hills come down off the mountains in long brown rolls in the grass, where it hadn't been pushed too hard, still stood thick enough to winter cattle on. I had been looking for it for 3 days. Wrong turn out of Clearwater Junction, wrong fork of the creek, wrong read on how far south the basin ran before the ground opened up. By the time the house came through the cottonwoods on that Thursday afternoon in June, my horse had a stone bruise she'd earned on a rocky stretch I should have walked her through, and I had been sleeping rough since Tuesday. The country was beautiful the way the Basin country is always beautiful in late June, the hills going gold and the mountains still carrying snow above the tree line, and I had been paying almost none of it attention, because a man who is nowhere in particular to be stops noticing scenery somewhere around the 3rd month. I saw the roof from a quarter-mile out. Any man who has spent time working buildings reads a roof the way another man reads weather. Your eye goes there without being sent. The north face had buckled along the ridgeline above the central span. 3 courses of shingles had let go from the east slope. The peak carried a sag that meant whatever was holding it from inside had given most of what it had. One more winter at that latitude, and the problem would stop being a roof problem and start being a floor problem. The rest of the place looked better than the roof suggested. Fences holding on the near side, barn sound, a kitchen garden going well along the south wall of the house, properly staked and producing in late June with the discipline of something planned rather than hoped for. Cattle in the near pasture, 20 or so head, thin but on their feet, which meant someone had worked hard through a difficult year to keep them there. I didn't yet know whose year it had been. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her name was Ruth Hollis, and she came around the corner of the barn at the sound of my horse with a pitchfork in one hand and an expression that had learned to read strangers at a distance before they finished crossing a yard. She was somewhere in her middle 30s, with dark hair caught back and eyes the color of creek water over flat stone, gray with a little green in it depending on the light. Her dress was a working dress, and her boots were worn at the heel, and there was a smear of something on her forearm she hadn't taken time to notice. "You're lost," she said. "Not a question. South of where I meant to be," I said. "Looking for the feed store in Clearwater Junction. Took the wrong fork. Feed store's 8 miles north." She had not put down the pitchfork. "The road back is the one you came on." I should have thanked her and turned my horse around. Instead, I looked at the roof. "That ridgeline's going to fail before October," I said. "The east end sag. That's structural, the purlin giving way. One heavy snow load, and you'll be looking at the sky from your kitchen table." She looked at the roof. She had the expression of someone who has been living with the knowledge of a thing for long enough that being told about it is not new information. "How much?" she said. "For the roof?" "For fixing it." My name was Emmett Cray. I was 43 years old, and I had been moving through Wyoming in a loose, purposeless way for 14 months, since the bank in Cheyenne had finished its patience and taken my place in the Powder River country. I had come to that ground at 30, hired on with a man named Tolliver who ran 300 head on the west side of the basin, and spent 12 years working my way into part ownership of the spread, earning it the way things are earned when there is no other way to acquire them, one season at a time. We had been doing well enough until we weren't. The winter of '80 hit the Powder River country hard. The summer after hit harder. By spring, Tolliver had found a buyer from Denver and moved to Colorado. I had taken his share of the debt along with my own and spent the next year trying to work it back and had not managed. The bank in Cheyenne was clear and not unkind about it. I cleared the house in April of '81, turned my horse south, and have been going nowhere in particular since. Working jobs when they came, sleeping rough between, telling myself I was resting from something when the truth was I had no particular reason to stop anywhere. The drifting had suited me for the first few months. Then it had merely been what I was doing. By the time I reached Clearwater Junction, I had been carrying the particular hollowness of a man who had spent 12 years building something in a specific place and then found himself with no specific place to be. A ranch is not just a piece of ground. It is a set of decisions you've made about where your attention goes, morning after morning, year after year, until the decisions are so habitual they feel less like choices and like breathing. Losing the place had not only taken the land and the cattle, it had taken the structure of the days. I had not yet found anything to put in that structure, and I had stopped looking hard for it. And that was, if I was honest with myself in the right mood, the real reason I had been sleeping rough for 14 months instead of finding a paying bunk somewhere and starting over properly. I told Ruth what the roof labor would cost. She told me she couldn't pay the full amount until fall shipping. I told her that was acceptable. She set the pitchfork against the barn wall, not quite putting away, and said, "Come look at what you're dealing with." I tied my horse and followed her. Up close, the damage was worse, as it usually is. The purlin on the east end had cracked through at the joint, not stressed, actually broken, and the boards beneath the failed shingles had begun to rot at the edges where water had worked through for longer than anyone had addressed it. Whoever built the house originally had built well. That quality of early craftsmanship was the only reason the roof had lasted as long as it had, and it had lasted about as long as it was going to. 6 days, I said. Maybe 8 if the boards underneath are as bad as they look on the east end. She was looking at the east slope. She had the expression of someone running precise accounting of what things cost against what was available to pay for them. "Do it," she said. "You can sleep in the barn." I started the following morning. The children appeared throughout that first day, the way children do when something unfamiliar is happening in their yard. The oldest was a boy named Cal, 12 years old, with a set to his jaw that announced he had decided to be the man of the place and was prepared to defend that position. He came around the corner of the house in the early morning and stood watching me strip the first section of failed shingles with his arms crossed, and a look that held both assessment and warning. "You any good?" he said. "Good enough to see what needs doing," I said. He considered this for a moment. "Mama said you're just here to fix the roof." "That's the job," I said. He went back to hauling water for the kitchen garden from the creek, a bucket that was a little heavy for him, which he was managing by going slower and not mentioning it to anyone. I watched him with the corner of my attention. The middle child was a girl named Dora, 8 years old. With her mother's eyes and a kind of direct curiosity, she brought her everything she encountered, including a stranger on her roof. She came to the base of the ladder in the morning, went away for 2 hours, came back in the afternoon, and spent both sessions asking questions with the focused efficiency of someone conducting a proper investigation. "What happened to the old shingles?" "They gave up," I said. "What gives up? What dries out and splits over time. Stops being able to keep water where it belongs." She thought about this. "Like skin cracking in winter?" "Close enough," I said. "My grandfather's hands crack in winter. Mama makes him put lard on them." "Same principle," I said. She went away satisfied and came back with more questions. She had opinions about my methods and delivered them without any apparent awareness that this was unusual. The youngest was a boy of 5 named Amos. He didn't ask questions. He came out to wherever I was working and stood at a distance of 20 or 30 feet and watched. He had pale hair the summer sun was turning gold and eyes fixed on things with a gravity most children his age hadn't developed yet. He held whatever happened to be in his hands. A piece of rope, a smooth stone, a worn boot that was too large for him by 10 years, with the same concentrated attention he gave to watching, as if both activities required the same quality of concentration. I didn't try to draw him in. You can tell with children whether they need be spoken to or given time to come to something on their own terms. Amos needed time. Ruth fed me at her table that first evening. Beans and salt pork and cornbread that was better than anything that simple deserved to be when made fast for a workday supper. The children ate. She ate. I ate. The conversation went where it went, which was mostly toward Dora's questions, because Dora had opinions about everything and delivered them between bites without apparent awareness that this was unusual for supper conversation. Cal ate with his eyes mostly on his plate, polite when he spoke, passing things without being asked, watching me in the sideways way boys watch grown men when they're deciding something and don't want you to see them doing it. Amos ate and said nothing, and at one point looked up and found me looking at him and held a look for a full second before going back to his plate. Not unfriendly, just somewhere that not everyone could reach. After supper, when the children were clearing the table, Ruth said, without particular emphasis, "I told him you're here to fix the roof. Passing work. I want you to know I said that." "All right," I said. They know it's temporary. I understand. She looked at the table for a moment, then at me. Wade's been gone 14 months. Cal is trying to carry more than a 12-year-old should and won't admit it. Dora attaches to people quickly. It's just her nature. And Amos, she paused. Amos is working through things I can't reach. She held my eyes. I need them to know the difference between someone who's here for a reason and someone who's here to stay. I looked at her across the table in the late daylight. A woman who had been carrying something large for 14 months and had gotten efficient at carrying it. I'll fix the roof, I said. I'll be out of your way when it's done. She held my eyes for a moment. Something in hers was complicated. Partly relief, partly something else she was not going to examine at her own kitchen table with a stranger in the chair across from her. Thank you, she said. It took 8 days, as I had predicted in the worst case. On the third day, Cal came to the east side of the house where I was pulling the last of the rotted boards and stood watching for a while. Then he said, "You need help with that?" He was built for work, with his father's shoulders already coming in on a 12-year-old's frame. I told him he could stack boards, and he did it for 2 hours without comment, sorting the salvageable from the waste without being told, which meant someone had taught him that material has value. His father, from the look of it. The sorting was too careful to have been self-taught. On the 5th day, he came up the ladder in the full heat of the afternoon, carrying a bucket of water, balancing it with the concentration of someone who will not spill a drop. He set it beside me and looked out at the pasture. That heifer in the far corner of an offer feed 2 days, he said. He was addressing the view rather than me. I looked at the heifer, standing apart from the herd at the fence line, head down, not grazing. She open, I said, calved in March. Lost a calf. I looked at her a moment. Check her temperature this evening. If she's running fever, it might be a retained placenta that didn't fully clear. That kind of infection can come back on them 2 months later. Cal looked at me. You know cattle. Ran my own place for 12 years. Powder River country. What happened to it? A fair question from a boy who knew that places could be lost. Went under, I said. 2 bad years back to back, and a bank that stopped being patient. He was quiet for a moment. My dad said that could happen to anybody, he said. He said the land doesn't care who owns it. It just waits. I thought about the man I had never met, and what he had apparently been worth as a father to this boy. He was right about that, I said. Cal picked up the empty bucket and went back down the ladder. That evening I heard him in the barn, and in the morning he came to find me before I started work and said the heifer was running a temperature, and what should he do? I came down and showed him. She recovered in a week. Cal treated her himself after the first day, checking her twice daily, handling it with the steady competence of a boy who had watched enough of this kind of work to know how it went. When she rejoined the herd and went back to grazing, he didn't say anything about it, but something in how he carried himself was different from a week before, in the particular way of someone who has done a thing they weren't certain they could do. The town of Clearwater Junction sent its opinion about the arrangement, as small towns do about anything they didn't organize themselves. The first messenger was Louise Anders, who came to return a canning jar to Ruth and stayed long enough to say what was on her mind. I was on the barn roof and couldn't hear the conversation, but I could tell by the angle of the 2 women in the yard that Louise Anders had come with prepared remarks, and Ruth was receiving them with the expression she wore when she was being patient with something she did not intend to discuss. Ruth came around to the base of the barn afterward and looked up at me. Mrs. Anders thinks the arrangement isn't appropriate, she said. What did you tell her? I said that I have 3 children and a ranch and a roof that would have gone to the ceiling before Christmas if I hadn't hired someone to address it. She looked at the new ridgeline. She'll tell people, but she'll also tell them the roof is solid. People will talk regardless. I said, Wade used to say the talking only costs you if you're listening to it instead of working, she said. She looked at me for a moment. He was usually right about things like that. She went back to the kitchen garden. I went back to the shingles. On the 8th day, I finished the roof. Ruth walked the perimeter and looked at the ridgeline and said, That's solid. It'll last another 20 years if nobody ignores it, I said. She looked at me. I was going to offer you supper before you headed out. Last 2 days stretched the estimate. Those last 2 days had been on me. She had told me she couldn't make up the difference until fall, and I had told her it didn't matter. She was the kind of woman for whom it mattered anyway. "I'll take supper," I said. After supper, after the children were in their rooms, Ruth set her hands flat on the table and said, "There's a south fence that's been giving me trouble since April. 3 posts that need to come out and be reset, and 40 feet of wire gone slack. Cattle have been getting into the Whitfield's hay ground, and he's been patient. But patience has a limit." "How much wire?" I said. She told me. I told her a day and a half, maybe 2. After that, she said, "The barn roof has a section on the north side. Not as bad as the house was, but it's going." She was giving me reasons to stay that she could call by their practical names. Legitimate reasons. Names she could defend. I understood it. It was a kind of honesty. "The fence first," I said, "then the barn." "Same arrangement," she said. "Barn for sleeping." Same arrangement. I agreed. Wade Hollis's study was a back room that no one had touched much since the previous April. His tally book sat in a stack on the shelf, for years of them, in the careful handwriting of a man who kept his own accounts. His brand registration papers were in a tin box on the desk. His family Bible held names written in 2 different hands. The brand iron hung on a peg by the door. Ruth gave me the use of the desk for my own working papers. I spread only what I needed and left the rest as it was. But I read the tally books. Not all of them. The 4 most recent years. I read them the way you read another man's accounting of his land and cattle. Carefully, with respect for what is there, because a tally book is not a diary. It is a record of decisions made and conditions observed, and it tells you what a man understood about his operation and how well he understood it. What Wade Hollis had understood was considerable. The allotment was the first thing I found. He had it noted in the 1876 book, the year he had formally applied for and received a federal grazing allotment on the government land running north from Kettle Creek to the ridgeline. 420 animal unit months on the going rate for grazing permits in the basin country. That allotment alone carried more value than the $800 figure I had heard Frank Hollis mention to Ruth as a fair sale price for the entire property. The water right was in the registration papers. Wade had filed on Kettle Creek in 1869, when he and his father first proved up on the place, under prior appropriation doctrine. The filing date predated the next nearest claim on Kettle Creek by 6 years. In this country, where dry summers are a fact rather than an exception, a senior water right dated 1869 was the kind of thing that serious buyers paid serious money for, and knew it before they made an offer. I sat at the desk with the lamp going, and the tally book open, and thought about what Frank Hollis had been telling his brother's widow about what this place was worth. I thought about a man driving in from Sheridan in a good buggy with a buyer already in mind and a number ready that had been assembled for convenience rather than accuracy. I told Ruth in the morning what I had found. She listened without interrupting, with the full attention of someone whose decisions carry weight and who knows it. When I finished, she said, "He told me $800 was fair for the deeded acres." "The deeded acres alone might be worth something close to that in a poor market," I said. "With the allotment and the water right, you're looking at something considerably different. I can't give you a precise figure, but any buyer who knew this ground and made that offer knew exactly what he was getting." She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the window. "Frank isn't a dishonest man," she said. "He's a man who decided what the right answer was and looked for fact to support it." "Yes," I said. "He thought I should sell and come to Sheridan. He needed the price to make that the right answer." "Yes," I said. She looked at me. "You read my husband's books. I thought you should know what was in them." She held my eyes for a moment. What was in hers was something between gratitude and grief, the particular combination of a person who has just found out that their instincts were right about something they had been told they were wrong about. "Thank you," she said. She wrote to Frank that afternoon. The tone of her at the desk, while she wrote it, told me enough about what the letter said. Agnes Whitfield came by in August with a wheel of cheese and a particular manner of a neighbor who believes that good relations, like good fences, require occasional attention. She was a broad, plain-spoken woman in her late 40s who had run cattle with her husband on the north section for 15 years and had a clear view of most things from long practice. Her husband Harlan said nothing that wasn't necessary and agreed with whatever Agnes concluded, which was less a sign of weakness than a good judgment about when to defer to someone who was usually right. She sat at Ruth's kitchen table, ate cornbread, and looked at me with the frank assessment of a woman who has no patience for indirection. "You the man fixing the barn roof," she said. "And the south fence," I said. She looked at Ruth. "Better shape than last fall." The roof was the urgent one, Ruth said. Agnes drank her coffee and looked at me again. She had made whatever calculations she was making and had come to a conclusion. The heifer, Cal's been treating her. "She's doing well," I said. Agnes nodded, slowly, in the way of someone who does not nod for no reason. She talked with Ruth about the coming fall works and the state of the cattle on the North Range, and whether Kettle Creek will hold through August, which it would. Before she left, she stopped beside me on the way out and looked at me with eyes that had seen enough to know what they were seeing. "Good fence," she said. It was a compliment about more than the fence, and we both understood it as such. Frank Hollis came on a Saturday in the third week of August in a good buggy from Sheridan, with a bearing of a man who believes his arrival will settle something. He came to the front of the house rather than around to where the actual work was happening, which told you something about how he thought of himself in relation to the place. He looked at the new roof. He looked at the barn where I was working on the north slope. He looked at me on the barn roof for a moment, longer than a man usually looks at a stranger, then went inside with Ruth. 20 minutes later, he crossed the yard to the base of the barn and looked up at me. "You the man she's hired?" he said. "Emmett Cray," I said. "How long are you planning to be here?" "Until the work's done," I said. He looked at the barn. "Wade left her in a difficult situation," he said. "She won't hear about selling, but she can't run this ranch on her own. She's too proud to ask for family help, so she brings in strangers." I pulled a nail and said nothing. "I've told her I can find a buyer who'll give her fair price," he said. "She and the children could come back to Sheridan where there's family. Better situation all around." I looked down at him. "Did she ask for your opinion?" His expression shifted a degree. "She's my brother's widow." "His widow?" I said. "Not his dependent." He looked at me steadily. "Be careful, friend," he said, without particular hostility, which was almost worse. "You're here to fix a barn roof. That's the beginning and end of it." He got in his buggy and drove out. At supper, Cal said, "What did Uncle Frank want?" "To be helpful," Ruth said, with the particular flatness of a true but incomplete answer. Cal looked at his plate. Dora looked at her mother. Amos looked at nothing specific. "Are we going to Sheridan?" Dora said. "No," Ruth said. Dora picked up her spoon. "Good," she said, and went back to her soup as if the matter had been weighed and put away. That evening, when the children were in their room, Ruth stood at the kitchen window and washed the same dish for longer than the dish required. I sat at the table mending a piece of harness leather and let the silence run. She said without turning, "He's not wrong that I can't run this place alone forever." "No," I said, "he's not wrong about that. He's wrong about Sheridan." "Yes," I said. She put the dish on the rack and dried her hands and sat down across from me. She looked at her folded hands on the table. "Wade's grandfather built this house," she said. "His father ran the first cattle on this ground. Wade was born in that back room. Cal was born in that back room." She looked up at me. "I'm from Ohio. I came out here when I was 22 and married into this place and spent 13 years learning every foot of it. The water, the grass, where the cattle shelter in a north wind, where the creek runs high in a wet spring and where it goes thin in a dry summer." She paused. "It's mine now because I learned it. Maybe it's more mine than it was theirs, because they were born to it and I chose it." I looked at her across the table. A woman who had chosen something deliberately and was not going to unchoose it because other people decided they knew better. "Frank can keep Sheridan," she said. "Yes," I said. She nodded once and went to bed. I went out to the barn. The August night was clear and full of stars, and the cattle were settled in the near pasture, and the land was quiet around us the way land is quiet when the people on it have, for the moment, gone still. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. September came in with a week of steady rain that moved the outside work inside. I started on the interior of the barn, replacing water-damaged stall boards, checking the structural members, doing the kind of work that gets set aside when more urgent things are pressing. Cal helped when his lessons were done. He had a natural mechanical understanding of how things went together, and after the first session of being shown how something was done, he worked without needing to be redirected. He had to understand the reason behind the method, not to argue with it, but because knowing the reason was how he held on to the method. One afternoon during the rain week, sorting through a box of hardware in a corner, looking for a specific bolt size, he said, without looking up, "Did you have kids?" "Before, when you had your place." "No," I said. "Why not?" "No wife," I said. Thought there was time for that later. Turns out later came before I was ready for it. He found the bolt and held it up and looked at it. Dad used to say things like that he was going to do this or that when there was more time. He set the bolt down. He was going to teach me to read a brand inspection sheet. Said we'd do it in the winter when things slowed down. He looked at the hardware box. We didn't get to it. I set down what I was holding. I went to the workbench and found a blank piece of paper and a pencil stub from the ledge above it and came back and sat down on the stall rail across from him. "Brand inspection sheet isn't complicated," I said. "I'll show you now." Something moved through his face, quick and controlled. The expression of a boy who has been careful not to want things he might not get. "All right," he said. We spent the rest of that rainy afternoon at the workbench. I showed him the registration columns, what the brand inspector is looking for when he passes a herd, how you read a transfer of ownership, what a clear title looks like versus a disputed one. He asked questions at the right moments and not at the wrong ones, which is a mark of someone actually learning rather than simply waiting to speak. When we finished, he folded the paper carefully and put it in his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time he had thanked me for anything directly. Dora had decided in the 5th week that I needed a name other than Mr. Cray, which she announced at supper, as though it were a matter requiring only notification and not discussion. "We should call him Emmett," she said. "Mr. Cray is what you call someone you don't know yet." Ruth looked at her daughter with the expression mothers were when deciding whether to correct something or let it go. "What do you say?" she asked me. "Emmett is fine," I said. Cal used it 3 times before supper was over, casually, as if he had been using it for years. Amos did not say it, but he had been getting closer, day by day, in the way he had of moving without appearing to move. By mid-September, he kept 4 feet between himself and wherever I was working, which was down from the 30 feet of the first week. He watched my hands in the evenings when I worked at the kitchen table, the same way he watched everything, with his full gravity, as if my hands were telling him something important that he needed to hear at the correct speed. One evening in early October, I was in the back of the barn reshaping a bent piece of iron at the small forge, and Amos came to stand at the safe distance I had told him about the week before, which he remembered exactly and held exactly, and watched the iron go from dark to red to orange in the coals. "Does it hurt?" he said. "The fire?" "Not if you're careful," I said. "Did you ever get burned?" I showed him the scar on the back of my left hand. He looked at it with his full attention. "Does it still hurt?" "Not anymore. Did for a while." He was quiet for a moment. "My dad's hands got cold when he was sick," he said. "He didn't like the cold." I waited, because this was more than Amos had said to me in one stretch, and it was not a thing to rush or fill. "I keep his watch," he said. "It doesn't run anymore, but it gets warm for my hand after a while." He looked at the forge. "That's like what you said. It hurts for a while and then it doesn't." I looked at him standing in the forge light, 5 years old, making sense of loss with whatever he had available to make sense with. "That's a good way to think about it," I said. He stayed beside me until Ruth called him in for supper. The crisis came in October, the way crises come in cattle country, without asking permission and without providing adequate warning. The first 2 weeks of the month had been mild, the deceptive kind of mild that the basin country produces as a courtesy before it does what October actually does in the mountains. The cattle had been moving freely across the lower pasture. I had been slow to read the sign. The real sign was in the clouds off the North Peaks in the late afternoon of a Wednesday, and the way the cattle had bunched against the south fence by supper time. Cattle bunch like that when they know something is coming that they would rather have a fence at their backs for. I told Ruth at supper that we should move the cattle to the lower pasture overnight. She agreed without discussion, which was how she handled practical decisions. And we went out in the last of the light and moved them to the gate and latched it. By midnight, the wind had the window frames working. By 2 in the morning, it was blizzard. At 4, I heard the gate post give. I knew the sound before I thought about it. The post, not the latch. The post I had looked at 3 weeks ago and meant to reset in the next dry spell and had not gotten it because there was always something more immediately pressing. The post had been rotted at the ground line, the same problem I found on the east fence, and in a normal night, it would have held another season. In this wind, with 20 head of cattle pressing against it, the post came out of the frozen ground like a pulled tooth. I was outside with the sorrel before the thought finished forming. What 3 hours in a blizzard on horseback looks like is something anyone who has worked cattle in the basin country in October already knows, and telling someone who hasn't done it doesn't convey it adequately. You find cattle by sound and by the horse's instincts, which are better than yours in the dark and the wind and the zero visibility. You push them back by moving behind the sound. You stay in the saddle and do the work until the work is done. When the sky went gray enough to see by, 14 of the 17 were back in the lower pasture. The gate post was back in the ground, as well as frozen earth allowed, which was not well, but it was holding. The wire was twisted and would need proper repair, but it was standing. 3 cattle were still out. I rode back to the barn as the full light came up. Ruth was in the yard. She had Amos on her back in some arrangement of blanket and coat that kept him out of the wind, and she had already been to the lower pasture and counted. 3 short, she said. I know. I'll go back. The creek bend east of the big cottonwood, she said. Wade always found strays there in a storm. There's a cut bank that breaks the wind. They know to go there. I'll look there first, I said. She looked at me across the yard in the early morning wind, her eyes fully awake with particular alertness that comes after a hard night and several decisions and the specific relief of someone who feared something worse and got something bad instead. Emmett, she said. I'll find them, I said. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she nodded and took Amos toward the barn. The cattle were in the creek bend, all 3 of them packed against the cut bank with their backs to the wind and their heads down, doing exactly what cattle do when they find a thing that will keep them alive and stop there. I pushed them back to the lower pasture in the clear cold of the October morning, the mountains white and sharp above the basin, the snow on the ground catching the early sun at the angle that makes everything look remade. I got them through the gate and latched it behind them and stood in the cold and looked at the place, the house and the barn and the smoke from the chimney and the garden gone to frost of season. I thought about Frank Hollis in August in his good suit, saying she couldn't run alone. He wasn't wrong about that. He was wrong about every conclusion he drew from it. 2 weeks after the blizzard, I came in late from the evening work and found the kitchen empty and the house in particular quiet it falls into when the children are asleep and a person is alone with something they've been carrying for a long time. Ruth was at the kitchen table. She was not doing anything. She was sitting with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on the middle distance and her face doing something that the daytime Ruth did not permit. I came in and set down my hat and coat and said nothing. She said he would have known about the gate post. She was not speaking to me exactly. She was saying it to the room. He had a way of knowing what needed doing before it became urgent, she said. I've been trying to think the way he thought, about the water, about the cattle, about what needs doing first. Her voice was even. The evenness was the effort. I'm not always right about it. Nobody is always right about land, I said. Wade wouldn't have been right every time. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet at the edges, held. He was more right than I am. You've been doing this alone for 14 months, I said. He had 20 years of learning this ground. She put her hands flat on the table. The steadiness she had been maintaining gave way, not entirely, but enough. She bowed her head and held it there, and her shoulders did what they do when a person has been carrying something too long, and, finally, for just a moment, puts it down. I sat down across from her and said nothing and let the moment be what it was. Outside, the wind had gone quiet for once, and the house was the only warm thing in that stretch of country, the lamp and the stove, and the particular stillness of a place that is holding its breath. After a while she lifted her head and looked at me without apology, because she was not a woman who apologized for the truth of herself. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the same practical gesture she brought to everything. "I don't know why I told you that," she said. "Because it was true, and there was no one else to tell it to," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I've been managing," she said. "I know I've been managing. I know the cattle are in better shape than they were in the spring, and the fences are holding, and the children are eating well." She looked at her hands on the table. "Managing is not the same as being all right. I've known that for a while. I just haven't had anywhere to put the difference." I looked at her across the kitchen table in the November dark, a woman who had been carrying the weight of a place and 3 children and her own grief for 14 months, and had been doing it without complaint or ceremony or anyone to take the other half. "Because it was true and there was no one else to tell it to," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in her eyes. Then she said, "Frank is coming again next week. He wants an answer. What will you tell him?" "That I'm staying," she said. "That this place is worth more than he told me it was. And that I have enough help to run it properly." She met my eyes. "Because I do." "Yes," I said, "you do." Frank came the following Thursday and sat at the kitchen table in his good suit and heard Ruth out. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. He looked at me. "The allotment," he said. "The water right." "I know what this place has," Ruth said. "I know what it's worth." He was quiet again. He had the look of a man who arranged the world a particular way and is having to rearrange it, and is honest enough with himself to acknowledge the first arrangement was wrong. "The buyer I had," he said, "he was a fair man. He wasn't trying to. He was trying to pay a price for something worth more than the price." Ruth said, "That's not fair. That's just not illegal." Frank looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked back at Ruth with an expression that was, for the first time since I had known him, not the expression of a man who already knows what the right answer is. "You were always going to stay," he said. "Yes," Ruth said. Wade knew that. Something moved through Frank's face. "He told me that once." He said you were the most stubborn woman he had ever met, and the reason the place would last." He paused. I thought he was being affectionate. He was being accurate. Ruth said. Frank nodded. He looked at me with something in his eyes that was closer to honest than anything he had brought through the door. "You're staying on," he said. A statement, not a question. "If she'll have me," I said. He looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at me. The kitchen was still. Outside, the October wind moved the cottonwoods, and the mountains stood white above the basin, and the cattle in the lower pasture were where they needed to be. "He stays," Ruth said. Frank accepted the coffee Ruth set in front of him and drank it and talked about the coming winter and what he could send from Sheridan that would help. Before he left, he stopped beside me on the porch and looked out at the yard. "Northeast corner post," he said, "by the property line junction." "I know the one," I said. Wade always meant to get to it. "I'll reset it before the ground freezes hard," I said. He got in his buggy and drove out without looking back. I went around the side of the house and looked at the northeast corner post in the gray late October light and added it to my list. I reset it 4 days later, before the ground froze hard, and drove it 3 feet into the earth the way it should have been driven when the fence was first built, and tamped it down solid, and walked the line from there to the junction and back. It would hold. I told Ruth what I wanted on a clear evening in late October, when the weather had gone still between storms and the sky over the mountains was the deep, particular blue the basin country produces on its best days. She was at the woodpile. I came around the barn, and she was putting kindling with the focused efficiency she brought to all physical work, and I stood beside the pile and waited until she set the axe down and looked at me. "I want to stay on," I said. She waited. "I mean more than the work," I said. "More than the fence posts and the barn roof and the hired hands sleeping in the barn." I held her eyes in the late October light with the mountains going dark behind the ridge and the cold coming in off the peaks and pine smoke from the chimney. "I know what you told the children. I know why you told them that. But I don't think it's the right answer anymore, and I think you know it isn't." She was very still. "Amos asked me yesterday if I ate breakfast in town," she said. I waited. He wanted to know whether to ask you at breakfast time or wait until you came back from wherever you'd gone. She looked at the axe handle. I told him you ate in the barn. I do eat in the barn, I said. I know. She looked up at me. I've been telling the truth about one thing at a time and calling that the whole truth. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. The evenings settled the way evenings settle in the basin country, completely and without hurry, the light going and the cold coming in behind it. Cal came to you with the heifer, she said. He hasn't gone to anyone but me since Wade died. He came to you in the 3rd week. She turned the axe handle over in her hands. Dora tells you her opinions. She saved them for people she trusts. She paused. And Amos, he talked to me for the first time in 4 months about his father the week after he started coming to the barn to watch you work. He told me about his dad's hands getting cold. She looked up at me. I had been waiting for him to say something like that for 4 months. He told you first. I thought about Amos in the forge light with his 5-year-old gravity and his father's watch in his pocket. Ruth looked at me. I am so tired of being afraid, she said. She said it the way people say things that are entirely, completely true. I know, I said. What exactly are you asking? She said. I told her, plainly, without decoration, the way I told her about the tally books, the way I had told her about the roof on the first day. When I finished, she picked up the axe and set it against the pile. Give me until morning, she said. Take the time you need, I said. She went inside. I went to the barn. The night was clear and full of stars over the basin, and the cattle were settled in the lower pasture, and somewhere in the house 3 children were in their beds. I lay in the hay and thought about a man I had never met who built good fence and kept careful tally books and filed on Kettle Creek in 1869 and told his brother that his wife was the reason the place would last. I thought about 12 years of mornings in the Powder River country, how I had known every draw and ridge of that ground, how I had read its weather and worked its seasons until the knowing was in my hands and not just my head. I had thought losing the place meant losing that. I had spent 14 months discovering that a man who has learned one piece of ground can learn another, and that the learning is the thing you carry, not the deed. I thought about what a woman is worth who learns a piece of ground the way you learn a language, by living inside it until it becomes yours, until you know where the strays go in a storm and what the grass looks like when it's been pushed too hard and which fence posts are carrying the weight of ground they shouldn't. In the morning, she told me yes. We married in November at the church in Clearwater Junction with Pastor Greaves and a small gathering. Agnes Whitfield sat in the front row and made no attempt to conceal that she had been hoping for this since August. 2 families from neighboring spreads came despite the road. Frank Hollis came from Sheridan and sat in the second row, and in the churchyard afterward, he shook my hand with the stiffness of a man who is right about being wrong and knows it. She's not going to sell, he said. No, I said. He looked at the mountains. The place is in better shape than it was in June. It is, I said. I have a list of what needs doing in spring. He nodded slowly. Something in his expression had settled. Not happily, exactly, but honestly. Then he said, the buyer knew about the allotment. I should have looked harder at the numbers myself before I brought him out. You meant well, I said. Meaning well and being right are different things, he said. I didn't argue with that, because he wasn't wrong about it. He went to find Ruth. I watched him cross the churchyard and stand beside her and say something that made her nod once, and then something in both of them settled. The way things settle when the version of events that was wrong gets replaced by the one that is actually true. Cal stood with me during the ceremony with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the pastor. Afterward, he shook hands with 2 men from neighboring spreads and did it with the quiet self-possession of a boy who has decided what this occasion requires of him and is delivering it. On the wagon ride home, all 5 of us with the mountains going orange in the last of the afternoon light, he said without particular preamble, the northeast corner post is solid. I reset it last week. I said, I know. I checked it. He was looking at the road ahead. Ground was soft enough to get it down to where it needed to be. 3 feet, I said. Maybe a little more. That'll hold, he said. He didn't say anything else. He settled back in the wagon with the expression of someone who has filed something away in a place where he'll find it again when he needs it. Dora held Amos's hand during the ceremony. Amos watched everything with his clear, pale eyes and his particular gravity. In the churchyard, he came and stood beside me while Ruth talked with Agnes Whitfield, and he put his hand in mine in the simple way of a small child who has decided where he wants to be and gone there. I held his hand and looked out at the mountains and said nothing. It didn't require anything said. December came down hard, and the basin country became what it is in proper winter, a long, cold stillness under a white sky with the mountains hidden in the clouds, and the work going on the way it always goes on, because the cattle still needed feeding and the water still needed breaking from ice, and the work does not stop for weather. Cal and I went out before light every morning into whatever the sky was doing. He talked on those morning rounds away he had talked from the roof, sideways into the air in front of him, not quite to me. He told me about the summer his father found the bad water source on the East Range and spent 3 days locating it before the rest of the herd went down. He told me about the way his father had read a horse's mood from the set of its ears before anything else. He told me about a winter calf they had pulled together, just the two of them, in a shed by lamplight at 2 a.m. when it was 10 degrees, and the cow was too weak to do it on her own. He told me the calf had lived, and they had given it a name, a silly name, the kind you give livestock when you stayed up most of the night to keep them breathing and feel entitled to something afterward. He laughed a little when he said the name. It was the first time I had heard him laugh. I listened. That was all he needed, and it was not a small thing to give. Listening to a boy talk about his father is an act of acknowledgement. This man existed. This man mattered. The things he taught you are worth speaking out loud. I had nothing to add. I just let the words be received, morning after morning, in the cold and the dark. The two of us go about the work that needed doing while Cal put down, piece by piece, what he had been carrying alone. Dora had established that supper was the proper time for opinions, and she did not miss a session. She had thoughts about the cattle and the coming spring and the kitchen garden and the right way to mend a sleeve and whether the Whitfield barn was oriented for the wrong prevailing wind. I listened and agreed where she was right and told her honestly when I thought she wasn't, and she received disagreement with the equanimity of someone who wants the truth more than she wants to be correct. Amos braided rope in the evenings. He had gotten good enough that the sections he worked on had the tension and evenness of something made by a grown hand. He brought his father's watch to the table sometimes and set it beside him while he worked, not looking at it, just having it there. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in the 3rd week of December, the sky low and gray with a look of more snow by afternoon. Cal and I had come in from a morning work, and Cal had gone to wash up, and I was at the door taking off my coat. Amos was at the kitchen table, with his oats in front of him. He said, "Pa?" He said it the way he said most things, without announcement, as a direct address, as if it were a word he had been using for some time, and this was simply another occasion to use it. He was looking at me with his clear, pale eyes. "Can I come tomorrow?" he said, "for the morning work?" I looked at him across the kitchen, 5 years old, with his father's watch in his pocket, and the kind of gravity that forms in a child who has seen loss up close and decided, without being told to, that the things worth having are worth paying attention to. He had held that watch in his hand every day for 14 months until it went warm. He had stood in the forge light and figured out, on his own, what warmth after burning meant. He had braided rope and watched my hands and moved closer, foot by foot, through the months, without ever once asking permission or announcing what he was doing. He had just said it, the way he said everything. "Yes," I said, "you can come." He went back to his oats. Ruth was at the stove. She had heard it. I knew she had heard it, because she went very still for a moment, her back to the room. Then she turned and looked at me across the kitchen, in the December morning light, and in her eyes was everything she had been afraid to lose again, and everything she had spent 14 months carrying alone, and everything that the Basin country, and the Kettle Creek water, and the 420 animal unit months of federal grazing allotment, and the brand iron on the peg in the back room, and the tally books on the shelf would outlast all of us. Cal came out of the washroom with his hair still damp from washing up. Dora appeared from the children's room with her composition book and set it on the table and studied it with the look of someone assessing whether their own work is right. Amos set his spoon down and took his father's watch out of his pocket and held it for a moment in his palm, feeling it go warm, and then set it on the table beside his bowl in the lamplight. We sat down. Ruth put food in front of us and took her own chair, and we ate breakfast, All 5 of us. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.